Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you for your presence, and get you a good portion of this, and we won't late. So, start off right off the bat, asking you any kind of insights that you might have from what you read. If you have anything to start off with, right into it. Yes?
I know God's not schizophrenic, but I felt Hosea just took me on a schizophrenic roller coaster ride. You know, that you got Homer taking, or Homer being wed as a prostitute, and all the terrible things that come to Israel. And then later, he forgives them and loves them and so forth. And at the end, he's like following animal. It just felt like,
Yes, it's going up and down like a roller coaster. Yeah. So they say it's divided up into two sections. Basically, most scholars, the first 3 chapters would be one portion of the book, and then the remaining 11 chapters, the second portion of the book. A little introduction with the marriage of the marital theme that is to reflect God's love for Israel. And it's a kind of a strange way of reflecting it in one way, but very pertinent in another way, because Israel is not the faithful bride that God would want her to be. And He needs to purify her. And so a great example of sacrifice and sacrificial love on behalf of this prophet, Hosea. And then it's interspersed, this book is interspersed with God taking Israel to court. Did you pick that up in your readings or your background? Because you all are doing some reading and footnotes and all that. But it's patterned, this book is patterned after covenant lawsuits. In other words, when somebody has offended, reached a contract back in those days, they would take them to court. Just like things don't change. And so, from Scripture scholars' understanding, this book is patterned after that kind of lawsuit, but God is the one taking the people, Israel, to court. And remember, this is the north, primarily. But Judah is in there. And speaking of differences, the roller coaster ride, Judah sometimes escapes condemnation, other times does not. And so Judah in the south again, the 2 tribes in Judah, in the south, Judah being one of the 2, Jerusalem being the capital, Ephraim being the capital in the north, centrally located in the northern part, but central as far as east-west, and the largest of the groups of the kings came from there. And so Hosea, being from the north, and being the only one from the north, and also challenging the north, prophesying the north. We're going to come to Amos, and he's from the south, and prophesies in the north. So, yeah, okay, that's one thing. So it's interspersed with taking them to court, calling them to repentance, but then revealing His love. Calling them to repentance, revealing His love. Okay, yes?
Is there any, Ephraim was so wicked, is there anything left of Ephraim, or is it just an archaeological site?
I have not visited there. It's near Bethel, and I've been there, Jacob's Ladder, and that was one of the places where that they worship falsely, syncretism, and I think that is in Ephraim. I mean, Ephraim is the capital of Samaria, and so I believe that would be considered where Bethel is. Yeah, right around there. And that's east. They continue to mention Baal, and that is the Canaanite god of fertility. And so that's the primary reason they're in trouble. Maybe the overview, I'm going to say this briefly. Basically, the overview is that the reason the prophet has to speak against them is, number one, Ephraim in the north, capital city of Samaria, one of the 12 tribes, Ephraim, one of the 10 up north. They have been making agreements with Assyria, which would be to the east, northeast, and Egypt, southwest. And so they're caught in between the two, and they're always looking for alliances to strengthen what they don't have. Enough weapons, enough warriors, enough kings, if you will. At least they don't think they have enough kings. And so that's number one. What happens again, as I mentioned last week, when they start making alliances with Egypt and Assyria, then you also have marriages, intermarriage. And that was not a good thing, because intermarriage brought the gods of the pagan nations, the wives of these pagan nations would come in, and they would say, this is who I've been worshiping, Baal. Really? And what was attractive about this? I'll tell you in just a moment. Let me get the other three. The other reason why the prophet was there is because false worship, and that's syncretism. They would worship Yahweh, but they also would worship these other gods of the Canaanite people. Another reason there was a problem is because part of this worship involved prostitutes. And I'll explain that in a minute. What kind of religious service is that? Okay, it ties into their understanding of this fertility god, Baal. Okay, and the fourth reason was social injustice. Social injustice. So alliances with these pagan nations, with God did not want them. He said, I have bound myself to you. You're betrothed to me. I'll take care of you. Don't trust in warriors. Don't trust in weapons. Don't trust in foreign alliances. Don't trust in false gods. Trust in me. I'm your king. And the people throughout history, they were always tempted to be like the other nations. You hear that a lot. And they want to be like the other nations. What did the other nations have? They had kings. And God was always saying, I'm your king. And only reluctantly did God ever finally give them a king. When Samuel said, hey God, do you know what? The people, they want a king. They want a king. And I told them, no. And God said, let them have a king. But Samuel went back and said, well, let me tell you what's going to happen. If you have a king, he's going to take your daughters and make them cupbearers and all this. And that's not going to be good. He's going to take your sons, and they're going to have to be warriors, and they're going to lose their lives. You're going to go broke. He's going to tax you. That's what the king's going to do. And they said, we don't care. We want a king. We're tired of these judges. The judges was the period right before the kings. And there'd be a judge that would usually be raised up from the north. And he'd come from Ephraim, let's say. And then he would be there for a while, a few years, when there'd be an uprising against the north. And what would happen? They'd win. And then the judge, it would be, here comes the judge. He wasn't a judge like in the courtroom. He was called a judge, but that was just basically a temporary king. He would lead the people into battle, and they'd win, oftentimes. But then they didn't have a standing army. And so no big taxes, not a lot of abuse going on. And so God said, hey, okay, I'm good with that. And people said, no, we're tired of it. We want a king just like all the other nations. And God knew if they were going to be like all the other nations, they had a king who could bring his gods in there and all kind of a taxation and a death and weapons and all that. Okay, so they got their king, and they got David, they got Solomon, they got all these, Solomon especially with all these wives coming in, these foreign wives who had foreign gods, and Baal was the biggie. And Baal means, or you might hear some people pronounce it Baal, and they pronounce it either way. Husband, Lord, master. But they didn't see him as husband, meaning good, but mainly a dominating kind of God. Okay? So, false worship came second after false alliances. That meant false worship because the kings start to dominate them and bring in other gods. They start intermarrying, and then they have prostitution involved with this worship. That's the third thing. And the fourth thing is they don't care anything about the poor. Now, just a little background. I'll try to tell you in 3 or 4 minutes because it does help about this book especially. But it's rampant throughout. This is what totally shocked probably everybody in the class, but definitely me when I started seminary. They said, here's the deal, guys. When they were in Exodus, in the desert for 40 years, they had one God, Yahweh. It was not as if the people in the desert believed there was only one God. Huh? Really? No. They just believed there was a God for them. Yahweh was their God. They didn't have questions about, well, I wonder if there are any other gods. They weren't interested in that. They knew that they had to be faithful to the God that led them out of Egypt and made a covenant with them in Moses, chapter 19 and beyond, and was with them in the desert, in the tabernacle in the desert where he was with their God with us, if you will, and then in the temple when they get to Jerusalem. So this is the God that's with them. So they're okay for 40 years, even though they're complaining, griping, like to go back to and get the melons and all that kind of stuff in Egypt, and God punishes them for complaining, sends them bread, sends them meat, feeds them from the rock, got the water, gets them the promised land. As soon as they get to the promised land, they cross the land of Canaan, the Jordan River, cross the land of Canaan, and here's what the shock was. Again, the first shock was they didn't believe that there was just one God. They couldn't believe there were many gods. They learned over a period that there was one God. That took them a while. What they understood first and foremost was there was a God who covenanted a relationship with them on Sinai. And it only later on dawned on them that that same God created the world. That same God created the world. I said, really? Yeah. What we do is children ask us, who made me? Mommy, where did God come from? Where does God live? Who made me? God made you. God made you. And then a little bit older, Jesus loves you. He's gone now. He's in the tabernacle, but not over the crash. God bless you. Take him over. See, that's baby Jesus. Baby Jesus, okay. But usually, for us, parents teach their children, God created you. God made you. And then Jesus comes on the scene, delivers us. Jesus died for us. God created you. Jesus died for you. Oh, okay. That's not the way the Jews were. Just the opposite. God delivered you on Sinai. He entered a relationship with you, a covenant communion, sealed with a meal, blood poured on the altar, blood poured on the people, read a book. You have to follow these commandments. He's taking care of it, feeding you with manna. Oh, okay. But how many gods are there? Didn't have that question. Did this guy create the world? Didn't have that question. Only later they go, I should have had a V8. Are you kidding me? You mean the God who has been leading us again, he created the world? Yeah. Wow. Who'd have thought? How many of you have been told that first time? Tonight, first time? Yeah. So I was totally like, really? Now here was the bigger shock. They get into the land of Canaan, and they've been taken care of for 40 years, but they complain a little bit, saying, we kind of like the taste of the food in Egypt. They get over to the promised land. As soon as they enter the promised land, it tells us in the Bible that the manna stopped. I don't know if you remember that, but it said the manna stopped. No more manna after they got the promised land.
And so they started looking around and going, look at these people. They're big people. They've been eating pretty good. We've been 40 years and, wow, no complaints, God, but let me just ask you, Butch, what do you eat? Oh, well, you just arrived? Yeah. Well, you don't understand? Oh, well, let me tell you how it works. We have this god. He's god of fertility. He's called Baal. He's symbolized by a bull. And we have these fertility rites. What do you mean by that? Well, we have church services. Seriously. And these services include prostitutes. Really? How's that work? Well, what happens is when we go to the temple, wherever they're going, wherever they're worshiping, we know that there's gods of fertility, there's gods of weather, all kind of gods. But Baal is the chief god, chief Canaanite god of fertility, and Asherah, goddess, and Astarte, goddess. And what happens is we want the crops to grow. So for pagans, they're not worried about morality. They go to church, they go to worship, not so they can be holier people. They go so they can get the goodies. They can keep eating. So they had this storm god, and they had this fertility god. And I could be wrong on this, but I think Baal was both. He combined both. He was both. And so they said, okay, this is their idea. Their gods are like they are. And so when they have a desire to have crops, they figured, how does that work? How do you get good crops? And they said, let's tell you the secret, you fellows, you newcomers. We have the prostitutes here, and that's because we want the gods to be intimate with one another. And when they're intimate with one another, then crops grow. That's what makes crops grow. The gods upstairs, being intimate, cause the crops to grow. Really? Well, I can't argue with you. You guys looking a lot better than we look. And we've been 40 years out in thing. Let's see how it works. And so they would go to these religious services. And they believed that if they joined to the prostitutes that were at the religious services, the gods who are like they are would look down and get jealous. And they would see what's going down on earth, and they're saying, whoa. And they would imitate the people at the religious service, therefore having communion, the gods having communion, because they're like human beings. And when they do have this intimacy, crops would grow. How many knew that before tonight? Every one of you? Wow. Okay, well, no, never heard that. And when it was said over and over again, nobody in the seminary ever said, let's keep telling Dal like that. He's the only one from down south that says that, one other guy from Kentucky. And we'll tell him another strange thing in the philosophy class. Anyway, so that is why you have adultery and idolatry throughout the Old Testament. They're linked together because God, when the pagans would have that kind of worship, and we'll call them the Jewish people, they're not called Jewish people then until they come back from Babylon, but the Israelites, Israel, they would go to these rites, and then they would be tempted to be involved in illicit sexual behavior. God was not happy about that, but the main reason he was not happy about the sexual immorality was because it was false worship. Both were seriously wrong. But the main reason, remember last week, I think I told you this, the primary thing was not sin against the poor. That was very bad, seriously wrong. That was the number one sin. And the number one sin was not sexual immorality with prostitutes. That was going on too. Terrible. The number one thing that was wrong was false worship, which was a result of false alliances, which caused false understanding of covenant, not only with God, because they had these alliances with pagan nations, bad covenants. They did not have a good covenant with God. They were not faithful to it. And so then they certainly didn't care about their neighbors. So it's a total breakdown. That's what happens when you don't worship God. Everything else goes south. And so that's what we can expect in the United States. If we have fewer and fewer people being religious, then you're not going to have a holier group. They're not going to be loving their neighbor more because they have more time now to help people. Because they don't have to go to church anymore. It's not going to doesn't work. Okay, just because that's a significant thing, it's not just Hosea. It's throughout the Old Testament. That's what they're constantly prophesying against, is this false kind of worship. Okay. Let's start with chapter 1, Hosea. Now, the word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of, and then they named 4 kings. So he prophesied during the reign of 4 kings. Now that first king, I think he was in 742, if I remember. You can correct me on that. It's been 37 years since I checked that. But anyway, but they were kings in the south, in Judah. There was only one king, Jeroboam, that reigned while he preached. The only one they mentioned here anyway. Okay. By the way, there are 2 Jeroboams. Now, Jeroboam, the first Jeroboam, is the son of Solomon, and that's when the kingdom got divided. Rehoboam and Jeroboam, 2 descendants of Solomon, fought for the power. One got the south, one got the north. We talked about that last week. Okay. Verse 2. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, "Go take to yourself a wife of harlotry." So she's already harlot. Okay. "And have children of harlotry. For the land commits great harlotry by forsaking the Lord." In other words, they're worshiping falsely. They're forsaking the covenant. And what covenant are they forsaking? Well, I'm doing a little extra reading here, and maybe you are too. But the people that I'm reading were saying, actually, Hosea, throughout this 14 chapters, he mentions subtle ways, and not quite as subtle as the others, about that covenant with Adam in chapter 6, covenant with Abraham, Mosaic covenant. He even says the Noahic covenant, with the bow in the sky. I thought that was a little bit of a stretch, but we'll maybe talk about that not too much. And the Davidic covenant. So those are the main covenants. They're all in this little book here of Hosea. But the main thing that he's focusing on when he's talking about the covenant, breaking the covenant, any kind of covenant breaking imitates maybe Adam breaking the first covenant at the very beginning. But the central part is the covenant on Sinai. Okay? So the 3 main covenants in the Old Testament are the Abrahamic covenant, Mosaic covenant, and Davidic covenant. Mosaic covenant is one that goes away, Jesus fulfills. Well, he fulfills everything in the Old Testament, but when he brings to perfection and then does away with, it's the Mosaic covenant. The other covenants don't go away. Abraham's covenant with Abraham, no. Descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the seashore. And the Davidic covenant, that doesn't go away. Jesus is king forever. But the Mosaic covenant was just for a time. Okay. Verse 3. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of the blame, and she took the blame. No, anyway. And she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, "Call his name Jezreel for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day, I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel." Okay? So he uses imagery about war and how he's going to crush the swords and break the bow and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, we're not going to be able to go through all of these, but how many children do they have? 3 children? Yeah. Okay. And so one of them was Have No Pity. One of them was named Have No Pity. One was not my people. Not my people. So the names of these people, these children, God tells Hosea to name these children to symbolize what I think of the people that have false worship. Because they're not going to be my people, because they're going off into Neverland. They're going to be carted away by Assyria. What's the other name, the third name? Which means what? Is there interpretation there?
Not my people.
Not my people. Well, it's not my people. There's no pity. There's a third one.
I am.
No, Jezreel.
Okay.
Was the first.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm asking you a question I don't know the answer to because I can't remember it. I know the other two. There's a third one here, and I know there's another.
Jezreel was just a place of bad.
Yes, right. Okay, I think somewhere else it shows where the translation of that is. I know.
Oh,
Okay.
literally God will sow.
God was so.
Yeah.
Okay, I knew it was somewhere.
S-O-W.
Yeah, S-O-W. Yeah, not S-E-W. Yeah, very good. Okay, all right, so let's look at verse 10. Yet the number of the people of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which can be neither measured nor numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, sons of the living God. And the people of Judah and the people of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head, and they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. So there's your up and down right there. So he's saying, not my people, no pity on you, but then it's mollified by yet. The number of the people of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which can be neither measured nor numbered. Now, what does that remind you of? Israel, yeah, but Abrahamic covenant. As numerous as the sands of the sea, stars in the sky. Okay, good. And notice, this is something kind of important. When you say, well, the Jewish people, well, the Jews, the name Jew comes from the tribe of Judah. Did you know that? That's where that comes from, okay? But the tribe of Judah comes back from Babylon. Well, all those other 10 tribes, they're gone. They're dispersed. So there are no more tribes up in the north. So the Jewish people, technically speaking, you don't have the term Jew until after they come back from Babylon. And they come back from Babylon in around the year 539 BC, just for your information, okay? But the 10 tribes sometimes are referred to as Israel, and Judah is from the south. They never call all 10 tribes Judah, but sometimes they never call all 12 tribes of Judah. They never put them all together. They never lump all 12 and say Judites. But they do link all 12 tribes frequently and call them Israel. Okay? So that gets confusing. Sometimes when they're talking about Israel, they're talking about all 12 tribes. I don't recall that they ever used the term Judah for all 12 tribes. It's just for the one tribe or the south. It's either talking about the south or one tribe. But Israel can be talking about all 12 or 10 of the 12. Okay? And so, you say, well, what's so important about that? Well, when they talk about the 12 tribes of Israel, they're talking about the north that was carted off to Assyria, but a remnant left, stayed in the north. A a remnant. And that's when Assyria repopulated, and then there was intermarrying, and that's where you get the Samaritans, the people who were left of the north, and the people from Assyria that were conquered lands, and the people were servants and slaves, and they left Assyria, and there was repopulation. Remember, I said because this would undermine any kind of thought that, hey, let's gather back together as 10 tribes and let's fight against Assyria. Maybe we'll fight and win again. No, there's not going to be a nation of the north. So these 10 tribes, the hope is, and certainly know about that, the hopes of the 12 tribes, where have they gone? Did they go to America? They're lost. And how is God going to get them all back? And 9, 10, and 11 is what the book of Romans is about. And I'll tell you, Scott Hahn, do you know what Scott Hahn says? No? Scott Hahn says, they ain't coming back like people like think they will. They're not going to be pure bread, pure, unadulterated, pure Jewish blood. And you're going to find 10 tribes that are going to go, I got my papers here. There's never been intermarriaging. I come from Jewish stock all the way, if you want to call it Israelite stock all the way. No, it's not going to be that way. The way he sees it, Scott Hahn, and he's pretty much an expert, he said, no, notice, and he's pretty good at it, they make a distinction in the New Testament. Not always, but sometimes they make a clear distinction between Israel and Judah. And they're going to be joined together. Well, what do you mean Israel's going to be joined together? I thought Israel was the Jews. No, we're talking about the 10 tribes. And Judah is the south. And they usually don't count the one in the south with Judah. And so he says, no. What happens is we're supposed to go out and speak to all the nations. And it's the Gentiles who now have intermarried with the 10 tribes. And they're going to be brought back. Meaning this concept of the Jews and the Israelites and the tribe of Judah coming together as one people. For much of the Jewish history, they weren't considering going out and getting the Gentiles. They were saying, the Gentiles are unclean. We don't eat with them. We don't have any dealings with them. But that's why God chose the Jews, so they would spread the good news and he favored them so the rest of the world would see how great this God is and they want to be a part of it. But the Jews came to see it as, no, we're so special. We got this God and he likes us the best and he's telling us to stay away from these people. No, it was a temporary way to eat among them so that when it came time, they were to go out. Now, since the tribes are lost, people get the idea that there's going to be this purebred, call that, 10 tribes, and they're going to be found somewhere, and somehow God's going to and people wonder, well, how's that going to happen? Well, Scott Hahn says, it's not going to happen that way. The way God's going to bring people back is not to get a bunch of Jewish people from the north and Jewish people from the south, and everybody's going to say, hooray! At the end of time, we finally, once all the Gentiles were fulfilled, now we got the Jewish people coming at the end of the world. Now, I have to say, Scott Hahn, he's a pretty smart dude, but he could be wrong about that. God could pull it off some other way, but it is hard to imagine how, and it is hard to imagine how that is going to be the ultimate victory. I mean, Gentiles are co-heirs with the Jews. We're one people now. We're not a two-tiered system where if a Jewish person came into the Catholic Church, we'd say, well, you can come in, but you're the chosen people, so we're going to give you first place. Or we're better than you are because we accepted Christ and it's taken you. Well, who's better? Jews who became Christians or Gentiles who became Christians? It's not who's better. We're one people. So that's why there's a lot of ink spilled over these 10 tribes and all that. And I know that this is a little background that we're not going to be doing with these other books, but I'm trying to give you a little bit of an understanding. And I'm not a, believe me, I'm not a historian, and I'm really not an Old Testament person. I'm just trying to learn with you. Okay, chapter 2. What time is it, Brian?
706.
Say to your brother. What time is it, Brian?
706.
No. Sorry. I didn't do that on purpose, but anyway. My people, and to your sister, she has obtained pity. Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband, that she put away her harlotry from her face and her adultery from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked and make her as in the day she was born, and make her like a wilderness, and set her like a parched land, and slay her with thirst. Upon her children also I will have no pity, because they are children of harlotry. And so he's going on and on. Let's skip a line or two. For she said, I will go after my lovers, who give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. See? They're connecting going to worship these false gods with, I'm getting the goodies. I'm getting plenty to eat. I've got wool, we got the sheep, we got everything going on my way. Therefore I will hedge up her way with thorns. I will build a wall against her, so that she cannot find her paths. She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them. And she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Who's she here? Who is this she?
Israel.
Israel, okay? Israel is Yahweh's bride. He's the groom. That's why Jesus, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, says St. Paul. Why? Because in the Old Testament, God is the groom, the husband. Israel is the faithless bride that God is covenanted, and he's not going to let her go. And by the way, the Jews are still the chosen people. By the way, I didn't want to minimize that. They're still the chosen people. God doesn't take back any promises. They're always going to be the chosen people. They are his elect. But when we talk about the elect today, we're talking about the elect, meaning those who end up in heaven. That's the elect. God chose us in the precious blood of the spotless Lamb before the foundation of the world. That's the elect. Along this plan of God, God selected the Jews for a primary purpose. Jesus, when he comes, he's Jewish, full-blooded Jewish. And he says to the Syro-Phoenician woman who's not Jewish, I have come to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. I've come first to the Jews. When Jesus ascends into heaven, right before he goes, he tells his apostles, go out and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Know that I'm with you always. But he came, he had to take care of business. He didn't come and say, okay, you rejected the prophets, I'm going to the Gentiles. No. Jesus comes and has to fulfill the Father's will. So what does he do? He has to show you, he's recapitulating in his life what the Jewish people experienced. Out of Egypt I called my son. Okay? So, Jesus, when is that? Well, out of Egypt I called my son. That happened when he came out of Egypt as a little baby with Joseph and Mary. But he is seen as the personification of God taking now Israel in the flesh. Jesus Christ is Jacob, Israel. Okay? Jacob, the name Jacob. What is it? Yeah. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob, the 12 tribes of Jacob. What are they? Israel. Israel is another name for Jacob. Jesus is Israel. He embodies Israel. So out of Egypt I call my son. And in chapter 11, in Hosea, we see that he also talks about Israel being a son of God. Not the son of God.
but a son, meaning an adopted child, meaning God has taken them. So in Hosea, just you have to think in many ways, like you're talking about, up and down, but you also have to think, well, what is she? Is Israel a son of God, according to Hosea, or a bride of God? What do you think? Both. Both, okay?
It's fullness, as you keep saying, the anger at the betrayal, and then the great tenderness, that are all these lines of tenderness, picking up Israel and the child and holding him against his cheek, and makes you think of some of the things Jesus says.
Oh, yeah.
Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often are gathered with
Exactly. Beautiful.
It's tenderness, and at the same time, it's you really messed up.
It reminds me of that Gillette commercial about 40 years ago when they would try to show you how close you could shave, and this young fella shaved, and then he took this little child, his child on TV anyway, and pressed him up against his clean face, you know, and just, so you're supposed to get the image of smooth. But I'm thinking about when you were a child, I held you to my cheeks, and then I was thinking, Christmas we just celebrated, and Jesus is a baby. Now, in this book, I picked you up and held you to my cheeks. Now God's going to reverse everything. Jesus said, you're going to come and you're going to pick me up. You know, you're going to pick me up. I picked you up, Israel, in the old. Now you're going to pick me up. But he's going through all this. And so what does Jesus do after his baptism? You know, crosses the Jordan. Okay? So he crosses the Jordan. The Jewish people cross the Jordan, go to the promised land. And there's the temptations. Jesus is baptized. And what does he do? Right after he's baptized, this is what happens. The last thing that you hear at Jesus' baptism is the Father says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Or, "You are my beloved Son," depending on whether you look at it, Mark or Matthew. So the last thing here, this is my beloved Son. And in the very next line, who speaks it? The devil. And it's in the desert. And the devil picks up from what the Father said. The devil says, the first thing he says in the desert, in the first place Jesus went after he was baptized, the desert. And the devil says, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to turn to bread." So, sonship. And so what happens? The three temptations in the desert that Jesus experiences are meant to serve as a recapitulation of the temptations in the desert that the Jews failed the test. Okay? They complained about the food. Command these stones to turn to bread. So the devil's got Jesus' own individual temptation. He's got to be hungry. But it also harkens back to the Jews. We're sick of this. We want to go back to Egypt where we can have food. Okay? And then trusting God. And then temptation to worship the devil. Anyway, all three of those temptations that Jesus experiences are meant to be real temptations. They are. In some mysterious way, he's really tempted. But at the same time, it's meant to be, this is my Son. Listen to him. And then we're supposed to look at that Bible and go, oh, this is what a true Son of God does. He's obedient. This is what a true Jew is supposed to do. Be obedient. Recognize his identity. Okay? That's what's going on. Okay. Verse 8. And she, verse 7. She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them, and she shall seek them and not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband. Who's her first husband? Yahweh. And when is they recalling? Back in Sinai. Now, that doesn't mean that the people in Hosea's time nobody was alive in Hosea's time that was alive in Sinai. Sinai happened, brain freeze here, but Sinai was in the 1200s or so, maybe even earlier than that, maybe as far back as 1400, anywhere between 1200 and 1400 years, right around 1290, they don't know. But hundreds of years before this, 500 years before this or so. So Sinai is where he betrothed himself to them. He took them out of Egypt, so he called them out of Egypt. I will be their God, and they, but he betrothed them with that covenant at Sinai. For it was better with me than now. Okay, so now Israel, that's a good day. Okay, I'm realizing that's what's going to happen. They one day will recognize this. And she did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil. I talked about that on Sunday. Grain, wine, that's Eucharistic theme. Oil, confirmation, you can say that. Well, that's a bit of a stretch there. That really is not symbolic of the Eucharist, okay? I think it definitely was on the first reading from Isaiah on Sunday. But this one is basically just talking about grain, wine, and oil, that they're trying to believe that these false gods are giving to them. Who lavished upon her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. Therefore, I will take back my grain in its time and my wine in its season, and I will take away my wool and my flax, which were to cover her nakedness. Now I will uncover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and no one shall rescue her out of my hand. In other words, he's been taking care of them all along. They've been giving credit to Baal. No, there is no such thing as Baal. But he doesn't say there's no such thing. He's just saying, I'm your God. He has to teach them slowly. He's not saying, and that's what goes on with the prophets. Sometimes they'll make it plain that there's only one God. But other times they say, there are many gods, but only one God. And I will put an end to all her mirth, her feasts, her new moons, her Sabbaths, and all her appointed feasts. And I will lay waste her vines and her fig trees, of which I said, these are my hire, which my lovers have given me. I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall devour them. And I will punish her for the feast days of the Baals, when she burned incense to them, and decked herself with her ring and jewelry, and went after her lovers and forgot me, says the Lord. Now, some people get confused about God today in the New Testament. Did God reject sacrifice? Well, sometimes you can start reading and go, I'm sick of your Sabbaths and your new moons. And you go, the Catholic Church goes by Easter, and they have Sunday worship, not Sabbath, that's Saturday. But they have Sunday worship, but God doesn't care about days. Some people might say that. Look in the Old Testament. He's criticizing all these feasts on the feast days. The Catholic Church got these feast days, and they create these feast days, and these new moons. Look at the Easter. When's Easter? Same time every year? What's the same kind of time? But not really. It's based on moons, First full moon after the spring equinox. Thanks. So it comes different times. New moons. No. But that's maybe one of the reasons why you see people thinking, priest. Are you a preacher? I'll be going to the Walmart or whatever. Are you a preacher? Well, actually, I'm a priest. Priest? Oh, okay. Where do you preach at? No, I priest at. No. Didn't you hear me? But they're not familiar with priest because some people, they don't understand that Jesus fulfills the Old Testament, and because there's a lot of criticism of sacrifice by the prophets, because they're not criticizing sacrifice. That was the core of what they were called to do. Sacrifice their lives and use the animals and everything else that was supposed to be their temporary way of coming to God. in eating these things. God had that. But you know what those sacrifices were really a result of? They were not the original plan of God. The original plan of God was that the father of the household is the priest. Adam was the first priest. The first priest mentioned in the Bible as a priest is Melchizedek, chapter 14 of Genesis. But the actual first priest was the head of the household, Adam. And that was the way it's supposed to be. And they didn't have Levites, the Levitical priesthood, until the Levites took up sword and killed all those people who were brave enough to fight against those who rebelled against Moses. Okay? In chapter 32, 33, 34, around in Exodus. So the tribe of Levi was, if you want to say, not the original plan. And then, so you have Jesus, he's from the tribe of Judah. So how is it that he's a priest? Because God doesn't have Levi as the original plan. Well, what was the original plan? Well, the head of the household. Well, how about Jesus? Well, he's from the tribe of Judah, but he's head of the household. What household? The new creation. The new family of God. Also, King David, the new Davidic covenant, the new family of God, and also Melchizedek. Where's he coming? Where's Melchizedek from? Well, we don't know because it doesn't say where he's from. And it says in the Bible, in Hebrews, okay, he had no beginning, he had no end. What? Did he have a beginning and an end? Well, because of Melchizedek, sure he did. But they say that because there is no record of who his parents were. But everybody else in the Bible, almost everybody else in the Old Testament, if they're significant, you know who their parents were. And you know where their burial ground is, almost. But they don't have anything about Melchizedek, where he came from, and when he died, and where he was buried. So they said, oh, Jesus is like Melchizedek. Because why? Because he had bread and wine to offer. He was from Salem, king of Salem, Jerusalem. Bread and wine to offer, not animal sacrifice, bread and wine, priest of the Most High God, and had no beginning, had no end. Are you getting me? You getting the drift? A lot of that imagery going on. Confusing. I mean, you got to have a church to help you to understand all this. But then comes the New Testament. Jesus fulfills all of that, brings it to perfection. But he fulfills it, but he doesn't wipe it away. Just like part of the 613 commandments, part of the Mosaic Law, are the 10 Commandments. Do we have to worship God? Yeah. Jesus didn't get rid of the 10 Commandments. He got rid of the ceremonial washings and all that, the certain kind of things that divided Gentile and Jew about eating and all this kind of stuff. He got rid of that. He got rid of circumcision as a requirement. But he didn't get rid of the 10 Commandments, nor did he get rid of the essence of sacrifice. But he changed what the sacrifice was. But he didn't change the eating of the sacrifice. He didn't change offering the sacrifice. He didn't change a Holocaust. We offer, that's a total gift. And who's our Holocaust? You know, Jesus. So the Holocaust, when we think about the Holocaust, in one way, the Holocaust was when they murdered Jesus. When we murdered Jesus. That was the first Holocaust. And then we talk about the Jewish Holocaust. Well, that was the first Jewish Holocaust. And it was great. Make sure I got this is great, meaning we're not talking about the Jewish Holocaust that happened in the last century. We're talking about Jesus offered his life as a total offering to the Father. Everything given up. Okay? That's what a Holocaust is. Everything is given up. So he was, if you want to say, the first Jewish Holocaust. The horrible Holocaust that we know about, where not only Jews were killed, but I'm trying to think. The focus was on killing the Jews and other people aligned with them, but to try to annihilate the Jewish people. Horrible, horrible, horrible. But now what we have is still an offering to God, the once for all offering on Calvary in the Mass, but also a grain offering. All right? Grain offering is the Eucharist, right? Thanksgiving. They had a Todah. In the Old Testament, Todah was a thanksgiving offering. It was a grain offering. You've got a Thanksgiving. It's the Eucharist. It's our way of returning thanks. How do we return thanks? By a Holocaust offering. Who is Jesus? The offer, the total, and he's, guess what? Going to take all of us because we're the grains into the leaven of society, the Jew and Gentile together, caught up in this once for all sacrifice that we call the Mass. So the sacrifice is not done away with, but because the people focus on the abuses of those sacrifices that we're talking about today, that they thought it was done away with. And that's why you have a lot of other groups that are Christian that focus on the preaching. Because the preaching is done in the synagogue. When the temple went away, the Jews had no more sacrifice. So in the early Christians, the Jews weren't sacrificing anything. Because what happened to the temple? It was destroyed in 70. After 70 AD, you had no temple, you had no sacrifice. Right? You got no sacrifice. So what did the Christians figured out? Jesus told us around the year 30, within a generation, 40 years, within a generation, the temple's going to be gone. They think that at first, but after the temple went, they went, I'm connecting the dots. And then they had no sense. Oh, Jesus is the same. Oh, yeah. What we did on Sunday, the Lord's Day, but it took them a while. They started going to the synagogue, and they were having the Lord's Day. They were doing Saturday worship and Sunday worship. But then when the Jews said, no, you can no longer, those who follow Christ are not welcome in the synagogue. And so that's when the Jews and the Christians had a little bit of a problem. You know about in the early church, they were prejudiced against Jews. That's kind of in the Middle Ages too, obviously. There was some difficulty about, well, how do we reconcile Judaism? Well, the early church, I mean, most of the Christians were Jews. So that would, but later on it became, okay, how does this all work out? But it was the fact that the temple was gone, and rereading the Old Testament and what Jesus said in the New, in that tradition, you realize, we see, Jesus is the fulfillment of this. And so he's the sacrifice. And what we've been celebrating on Sunday, yes, we have. So actually the Jewish people in the synagogues, they had to make a choice. And this was difficult. Some went back to Judaism. That's what the book of Hebrews is writing to, addressing Jewish Christians who are now thinking, hey, the temple, what happened? What are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to? And the author of Hebrews is writing to them, no more. The pure worship is Jesus Christ. He's the priest, and the temple's in heaven. And that's where the new temple is. And it's also, yes, but the focus is Christ's priesthood in heaven. And he talks about there's no longer a priesthood on this earth. That used to be passed down generation to generation by blood. Jesus has another kind of priesthood. It's in the Spirit. And he reigns from heaven. And he mediates his grace from his throne in heaven. And he has opened up by the blood that he took to heaven. And what do priests do? They offer sacrifice. And Jesus is a priest forever. Therefore, he must be offering sacrifice in heaven. But Jesus doesn't die in heaven. The essence of sacrifice is not murder. It's not dying. It's giving of yourself. And so that's why we can say that the Mass is a sacrifice, but it's not a murder going on. Jesus doesn't die, but he does give himself to the Father in the Mass. But that offering goes on forever. At the end of the world, there's still going to be Jesus offering himself to the Father. There's not going to be a Mass. There's going to be the wedding supper of the Lamb, which is what we do here. We anticipate it and participate in it on Sunday. What time is it, Brian?
7:31.
Sorry, I'm 1 minute late. Okay, so
get to,
We'll all the way to 14 next time. We'll go a little faster, okay? I expect you all to come with questions and insights, and not that you'll have to answer everything, but if you do come, I won't be talking as much next time, okay? Thanks.